Hello and welcome to the second episode of Praemunire, the law that brought down Thomas Wolsey, the Catholic Church, Catherine of Aragon, and the Monasteries. This episode takes us from the murder of Thomas Becket in 1170 to the reign of Richard II, beginning in 1377. As we saw in the previous episode, King Henry II's attempt to draw back authority to the sovereign over the Church in England had culminated in one of the most notorious events in history. Henry II had compiled the 16 articles of the Constitutions of Clarendon, which demanded reform in the Church. But the Archbishop of Canterbury's vehement, vociferous condemnation of the king and his constitutions caused Henry outrage. "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" he cried. Well, yes, they would, and did, and so ended Becket's life, but not his name and legacy, which reverberate to this day. The blame for the murder was placed squarely on King Henry II's shoulders, and he bore the consequences for the rest of his life. So in this long struggle for control of the Church in England, what next? Well, let's find out. The murder of Becket created outrage, not just in England, but throughout Christendom, and only served to cut short Henry II's attempt to reform, or rather re-establish royal control of the Church in England, such as his great-grandfather William I had enjoyed. There was a further setback to royal control during the following reign of Richard I, Richard the Lionheart, whose protracted absence, fighting all and sundry across Christendom, only succeeded in opening the doors even wider for the administration of papal hegemony. Indeed, his brother John, when he acceded to the throne, was excommunicated by the Pope and kicked out of the Roman Catholic Church altogether. Kicked out, that was, until he went crawling, literally crawling, grovelling on his hands, knees and chest to kiss the papal legate's feet as he begged forgiveness and readmission to the Church. And not only that, signed his entire kingdom over to the papacy. Of all the English kings, Henry III was the most friendly towards the papacy, and by some distance. He had his problems with his subjects, for sure, and not least the rebellious Simon de Montfort, but so far as popes were concerned, for the most part he danced with acquiescent aplomb, jigging along to the papal tune. Of course, in that time of erecting ecclesiastical buildings, he built, or at least rebuilt, Westminster Abbey. Henry I's son, Edward I, however, was an altogether different man, and he kicked back and punched back hard against the clergy. He, in 1279, introduced the Statute of Mortmain, aimed at the Church to prevent land from passing into the hands of immortal institutions, and so out of control of the taxation system operated by the state. Immortal institutions, hence the name mortmain, translates from French as a dead hand. In short, the Christian Church, unlike a mortal landlord, was never expected to die, and thus far, today, the Christian Church lives on, immortally. Land ownership by the Church is perpetual, and thus, unlike a mortal landlord, was not subject ever to any death duties or feudal service, ultimately to the sovereign. King Edward I introduced as an executive order the Circumspectae Aegatis, which laid down his law regarding the jurisdiction of civil courts, thus confining ecclesiastical courts to ecclesiastical matters only. In the final parliament of his reign in 1307, held at Carlisle, which was chiefly called for the discussion of the governance of Scotland, the Commons digressed. They went off on another tack altogether and opened their petition thus: to our Lord the King, Earls, Barons, and the whole community of the land, pray for aid and remedy for the oppressions listed below, which the Pope causes to be carried out in this realm, to the destruction of God's faith and the ruin of the estate of Holy Church in the realm, and the disinheritance and prejudice of the King and his crown. The papal appointments, damaged the entire realm because, they said, because the Holy Church in all its estates of prelacy in the realm was founded by the King and his ancestors, and by the said earls, barons, and their ancestors. That was to say, the Church in the British Isles was not founded by the Pope. The Commons further complained that the Pope comes and appropriates himself to the lordships of such possessions as if he were their patron, and gives the aforesaid dignities to aliens who never reside there, and to some who cannot reside there, for example to cardinals, something unheard of before now, so that soon, if this thing is allowed to continue, there will be no dignity which is not in the hands of aliens. Edward I died not long after the Carlisle Parliament, and during the reign of Edward II, complaints rumbled on about papal provision, papal appointments of foreign clergy to high-ranking positions in the Church of England, to the detriment of the English Church. The term provisors is to say provide, supply, deliver, and so on, found its way into the Ordinance of Provisors, an order regarding the appointment of bishops and abbots. It was to deal with the papal provision, the supply of foreign, usually absent clergy to English benefices, and to address the continuing court appeals being made outside the kingdom to be tried in the papal court. So here we are again, foreshadowing the legislation of the Reformation Parliament during the reign of Henry VIII. The 100 Years' War began in 1377, a war with France which lasted for, 115 years. Disagreements within the papacy had determined that there were now two popes, one in Rome, which England recognised, and the other in France, at Avignon. 1348 saw the outbreak of the Black Death, that infamous plague that wiped out great swathes of the population, and then, in the 1351 Parliament, sanctioned the first Statute of Provisors. The parliamentary session opened with a recital of the 1307 proceedings at Carlisle. They claimed that the grievances that had led to the Statute of Carlisle continued. They said, more than ever before, in greater destruction of the realm than the entire war of our Lord the King, inasmuch as this money is sent to the court of Rome year after year without ever returning, and it annually amounts to more than the King takes from his realm. So far as Parliament was concerned, then, the amounts of money being sent to Rome was of more concern than the cost of the war with France. Parliament, with some degree of glee, voted the bill onto the statute book, and King Edward, his quill, ink and wax at the ready, stamped and signed it into law. Edward III, in our time, has been identified as the perfect king. Indeed, a chronicler in his time wrote that his like had not been seen since the days of King Arthur. Yes, he's had his detractors, but of all the English kings, it's difficult to name one who has over time received more accolades than Edward III. As his 50-year reign progressed, he steadily drew authority over the church back from Rome. But there was still more to come. Because the effect of the statute was to induce a threat from the Pope to excommunicate the entire Kingdom of England if it were not withdrawn. It was quite some threat from the Pontiff, who shortly after announcing the ultimatum, he died. Parliament was soon back to further its grievances with the Rome. It assembled in 1353, from whence the first statute of Praemunire emerged. The statute imposed hefty penalties on those who sought to appeal outside the realm to Rome, in cases that could be heard in the king's court. Those intent on undermining royal authority in favour of papal authority were to be severely punished. Thus was the first statute of Praemunire. In 1365 there was a second enactment of the statute of Praemunire, but this time it was the king who put his complaint before Parliament. He was rattled because, among other grievances, the Pope had blocked the marriage of his son Edmund of Langley to Margaret, heiress of the Count of Flanders. And in addition to that, there were still appeals being taken out of the kingdom to be heard in Rome. The Commons seemed to take some pleasure in adding another reinforcing statute to the book in their campaign to push back against an overmighty Roman Catholic Church. The 1370s saw a still further escalation of anti-papal sentiment to add spice to the already simmering aversion to the clergy. In the parliaments of 1372, 1373, 1376 and 1377, complaints were made yet again about papal provisors, that ongoing papal supply of foreign, absent clergy who were in possession of English benefices. The Commons were up in arms over these absentee clerks from the other side of Christendom, who farmed their English parishes and dioceses from where the healthy profits found their way back to the papal court at Avignon. The succession of complaints in Parliament, however, is perhaps a reflection of the influence that it had acquired over the preceding decades. Its members were confident that they had the power, real power, to get things done. The kingdom that Edward left behind when he died in 1377 was very different to the shambles he had inherited 50 years beforehand, and, so far as the church was concerned, his subjects accepted him as the head of the church in England, as they had William the Conqueror and his early descendants. After the reign of Edward III, we enter what must be the most intriguing and contentious period of English history. Enter John of Gaunt, John Wycliffe, Henrys IV and V, and others, and all muddled up with poetic license by William Shakespeare. So please subscribe now for the next episode of Praemunire, the law that brought down Thomas Wolsey, the Catholic Church, Catherine of Aragon, and the Monasteries.